Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another weekly episode of our STEM10 Plus series. My name is Johnny, and I'm a STEM outreach ambassador at UC San Diego Create. I work alongside Ronnie, Archie, and Beto, who you've seen in the previous lessons. So, what are we going to talk about this week? We're going to be talking about cells and organelles, but vaguely as a topic, we're going to call it cell biology. Ideally, it's for students in grade 6 or higher, but we're going to talk about things very simple, very easy, very digestible, so everyone at home can understand the different parts that make up a cell and the differences between different types of cells. So, for starters, what are we going to need for this activity? So, we're going to be using coloring pencils, markers, or crayons, or any other pretty much coloring material that you have at home. And we'll be using the coloring printout that's going to be attached in the video in the description section, okay? Before we get started, we want to give a special thanks to the Scripps Research Institute and the Kellogg School of Science and Technology for giving us this resource, the Coloring with Cell activity book. So the coloring activity and drawing activity that we're going to be doing with you today, step by step, was taken from this activity book, which they were very gracious enough to donate and let us use. So for starters, we're going to talk about a little bit of what are cells. So in a very simple way, all living things are made up of cells. They're pretty much like tiny building blocks, and they're the most basic unit of life that exists on this planet. Uh, a lot of people don't know this, but all animals, plants, and humans are made up of millions and millions of cells. There's organisms that are made just from one cell, which are called unicellular, and there's organisms that are made up of a lot of cells. Those are called multicellular. Cell types are categorized based on their complexity, and they can be divided between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Now, what's the difference between a prokaryotic and eukaryotic cell? So, a prokaryotic cell is the simplest organisms that are only made up of one cell. So, these are actually the first cells that were ever to exist on this planet. What makes them different from the other cells? Well, this prokaryotic cell don't have a nucleus. So, we're going to talk about what a nucleus is later in this video, and they don't have any other internal compartments or very complex organelles. So a eukaryotic cell is any plant or animal cell that it's much more complex and has internal compartments called organelles. All right. An example of a single-celled eukaryotic organism is yeast. Most other eukaryotic cells are going to be multicellular. So make sure you remember that. Now we're going to talk about what are organelles. So you might have already guessed it. Organelle, organelle, organ. So an organelle is pretty much the organs of a cell. Just like us humans have different organs like our heart, our lungs, a cell has organelles, which are its organs that have different functions that make it what it is. So in most complex organisms that are multicellular, they have lots of different types of organelles, each designated to have a different function within the cell. These organelles are parts of the cell that carry out various functions and allow for the cell to have very independent operations going on at the same time. Now, for the purposes of this coloring activity and this drawing activity, we'll be focused on eukaryotic cells, okay? And then later on in the video, we're gonna talk about the different characteristics that distinguish some eukaryotic cells from other eukaryotic cells. Now, the first organelles that we're gonna be talking about are gonna be the plasma membrane, the cytoplasm, and the centrioles. So the plasma membrane, if you've ever heard of before, it's pretty much that large barrier that's going to be outside of the cell. So that's going to pretty much going to be the exterior of the cell. It's going to be a very flexible wall that it's going to allow for things to go inside, but it's also going to keep things inside of the cell so it doesn't just go outside. And then the cytoplasm is going to be the free floating liquid in which all the organelles are going to be out inside of the cell. And then one of our first complex structures that we want to talk about are the centrioles, which help when they divide and become even more cells. So in this drawing here, which is going to be our first step in our coloring activity, I went ahead and colored the plasma membrane here in orange. Okay, so make sure you don't have to pick the colors that I did. I just chose orange because it's the color that came to mind. So you're just going to go ahead and color in this plasma membrane. Okay. Now, I didn't color in the cytoplasm because it was going to take a long time. But the cytoplasm is going to be all this blank space, pretty much where there's no other organelle. That's going to be the cytoplasm. Think about it as just all the water that's inside the cell. Okay. And then the first structure that we talked about are going to be the centrioles. So when I think about centrioles, I think about them as being packets of spaghetti. Why? Because as soon as you open up a packet of spaghetti, you're going to have all the different spaghetti pastas going all over the place. So that's pretty much what centrioles are. When you open up that centriole, all those different spaghettis are going to go to different parts of the cell and are going to help move things from one side of the cell to another. Now, the next two organelles that we're going to be talking about are going to be the nucleus and the nucleolus. So the nucleus pretty much is going to be the brains of the cell. It's going to be telling each organelle what to do, when to do it, and pretty much is the boss in charge of getting everything done, okay? Now, something very interesting is that the nucleus, just like we said that it's the center of the cell, the nucleus also has a nucleus of its own, and that's called a nucleolus. So it's inside of the nucleus. This nucleolus, one of its main functions is to make ribosomes, which are other different types of organelles that help make protein inside of that cell. Now, in this part, what I did is colored the nucleus here in this shade of navy blue. Again, you can pick whatever color you want. And then I shaded in the nucleolus in this little baby blue type of color, just to remind me that, it's a part of the nucleus, but it's a structure in and of itself as well. The next organelles that I'm going to be talking about are going to be the endoplasmic reticulums and the ribosomes. So the endoplasmic reticulum, we abbreviate it as the ER. Now, something very interesting is that we have two different types of endoplasmic reticulum. We have the rough ER, which contains ribosomes that makes protein. Okay, so when we say rough ER, it always has ribosomes on its surface. Now, there's also a different endoplasmic reticulum, which is called the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and this primarily makes fats, okay? Or these fats are also called lipids. And then, like I previously mentioned, we also have our ribosomes. So what's our ribosomes? Ribosomes are pretty much gonna be our protein-making workers inside of our cell. So they're gonna be making structures like nucleic acids and the different types of proteins that the cell needs to function. And here in the image that we have here, so we have the rough ER, and we have the smooth ER, and then in conjunction, we're going to be calling them just the endoplasmic reticulum. So something very important is that we have the nucleus, which is very intimately bound to our endoplasmic reticulum, okay? Now, on this left side, we have a rough ER. Why rough? Because we see all these ribosomes that are on the membrane of that endoplasmic reticulum, which is why it gives it a little bit of a rough appearance. So that's what we call it, the rough ER. On this right side, we have the smooth ER, all right, which has no ribosomes on it. And this, so we're going to say that this rough part, we're making proteins and nucleic acids. And on this smooth part, we're going to be making fats. Now, something that I didn't mention before is that these ribosomes, or these protein little workers, they're not just going to be bound to the endoplasmic reticulum, okay? They're going to be also floating freely throughout the cytoplasm, making proteins that are going to go to different parts of the cells. Now, the next organelles that we're going to be talking about now are the Golgi body, or the Golgi complex. And this is after these lipids leave the endoplasmic reticulum, they're going to go over to the Golgi body so they can be delivered to the membrane, right? The membrane that we have is the exterior of the cell. And how is it going to get there? Are they just going to walk up to the membrane? Here I am? No. Well, what we're going to do is that we're going to package them, and we're going to be packaging them in little structures called vesicles, right? So what these are is that, think about as water balloons, right? They pinch off of our endoplasmic reticulum with all the proteins and the contents that we need to get to the plasma membrane, and they're going to get to the plasma membrane, and they're going to fuse with the membrane, and then they're going to transfer whatever materials they need to the different parts of the cell. And then for the purposes of our coloring activity, we went ahead and colored our Golgi body here in yellow. Now, the next organelle that we're going to be talking about is super, super, super important. It's going to be the mitochondria. So the mitochondria is pretty much the energy center of our cell, right? Some people even call it very famously as the powerhouse of the cell because it creates cellular energy in the form of ATP. And then in our coloring activity, our mitochondria is going to be this little sucker over here. And then I colored in the mitochondria purple. Again, you can color it whatever color you want. And then I went ahead and drew in here, I wrote ATP, just to remind me that the mitochondria creates energy in the form of ATP. And this ATP is going to go to different parts of the cell, whatever energy is needed. Okay, so remember, mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell, creates ATP. It's not the only organelle that creates energy. We're going to talk about it a little bit later in the video, but keep in mind that the mitochondria, its main function is going to be making energy in the form of ATP. Now, I put this as all the somes because all of these organelles end at some, but they do have very distinct functions inside the cell. So the first structure is going to be the lysosome. What the lysosome is pretty much going to help get rid of all the waste that's generated when all these different organelles are working inside the cell. We also have peroxisomes, which break down fatty acids to be used in the membrane and fuel for respiration. And then respiration is just pretty much the process by which the mitochondria make energy. Another function of the peroxisomes is to transfer hydrogens from one compound to another. And in the process, at the end, they make water. And water is very important for a cell's needs. And then lastly, we have our endosome, which sort and deliver material from the cell surface and transport materials from the Golgi to the lysosome to be degraded. So if anything needs to get thrown in the garbage disposal, well, cells don't have a garbage disposal, right? So we're going to package them in endosomes, take them to the lysosomes, and then they're going to break them down and get rid of the waste and recycle different products that our cell might be able to use. Think about it as recycling materials that our cell can still use. And then over here, I've colored my endosome in a different color of green, my lysosome in a color of blue, and my peroxisome in a shade of red, just to meet for allowing me to distinguish that although they do look the same, they have very different functions. Now we're going to talk about the differences between plant and animal cells. So both plant and animal cells have organelles that I mentioned before. All of plant cells and animal cells can have all the ones that I mentioned before. Now, the most significant difference between the cells that you will find in a plant and an animal are the cell wall, vacuoles, and chloroplasts, right? It's not the same for me to have a cell in my body because I'm an animal, as opposed to if I go to my yard and I pick up a flower, which is also made up of cells, they're going to have very different structures and contents inside of them that distinguish them from my cells. Now, the first one that I want to mention is the cell wall. So the plants have a rigid cell wall surrounding the plasma membrane. These cells' walls usually give these plant cells a more of a rectangular structure, and it allows them to stand upright without the need for anything else. Now, the chloroplast. What's very important about the chloroplast? Think about chloroplast as the plant's version of the mitochondria. So chloroplasts generate energy through photosynthesis. What's photosynthesis, you might ask? It's the process by which plants make energy for themselves. So they need sunlight. That sunlight hits the chloroplast inside of the cell. And through a lot of different processes, the chloroplasts are going to be generating energy in the form of ATP and as well as the synthesis of sugars. But for our purposes, we're not going to get into that topic. Just remember that they generate energy through the process of photosynthesis. They also generate energy just like the mitochondria, but chloroplasts only exist in plant cells. That doesn't mean that there's no mitochondria in some plant cells. Some plant cells do have mitochondria, but the chloroplasts are exclusive to plant cells. No animal cell will have a chloroplast, okay? Now, another thing that's very important in plant cells that distinguish them from animal cells are the vacuoles. Plants have a single large vacuole in the center of them, whose main function is to store water and sap. The vacuole increases or decreases in size depending on the amount of water stored in them. Okay, so remember that. So, whenever a plant needs water, it's very common for these vacuoles to shrink and it will make your flower or your plant droop. So whenever you see a flower just wilt down, well, what does it need? It needs a little bit more water. Animal cells do have vacuoles, okay? That's very important that we know, but they're usually smaller and there's more of them and they have different functions. Now, for the purposes of this activity, since we didn't have these structures in our coloring template, we're gonna go ahead and add them ourselves, right? So the first thing that we added was our cell wall. And I did this just by drawing a rectangle on the exterior of our plant cell. And I did it in green just to remind me that, you know what, plants are green. So that came to mind right away. The second thing that I drew in was our chloroplast. So I made it look here like a stack of pancakes because that's usually how they look. And I drew it right next to the mitochondria just to make me remind myself that they also produce energy. Okay. And then here in the center of our drawing, I went ahead and added the vacuole just to remind myself that plant cells have a large central vacuole, and I did it in blue for the storage of water. Now, just how I talked about these structures being exclusive to plant cells, there's also very different structures that are exclusive to animal cells, okay? So the first of them is cilia. Cilia are these external protrusions or extensions that come out of the plasma membrane that allow the cell to move. and they look like tiny hairs pretty much all around the exterior of our animal cell. And they also might have flagella. So what the flagella is a single long projection that looks like a whip or like a tail that allows the cells to propel themselves forward and move. So think about it as that tail whipping around very fast and moving the cell across wherever it needs to be. Animal cells either have cilia or flagella, but they can also have both. But very important, plant cells do not have cilia or flagella. And in my drawing, what I did to describe the flagella and the cilia is for the cilia, I added these little gray hairs coming out of the cell just to remind myself that they're only in animal cells. And then for the flagella, I gave it a long, almost tentacle like tail coming out of it to remind myself that it allows the cell to move. So now the moment you've been waiting for, the giveaway. So the first 25 people that comment on either the Spanish or English version of this video and send us an email will receive a free coloring with cell activity book courtesy of us and our friends at the Scripps Research Institute. So go ahead, if you want one of our coloring with cell activity books, reach out to us so we can get that to you as soon as possible. That's it for now, friends. We hope you enjoyed this week's lesson from our STEM 10 Plus series. My name was Johnny, and we hope to see you next week for another fun STEM lesson from our neighborhood scientists that create. Goodbye and take care.